Ava DuVernay, the director of the acclaimed 2019 series When They See Us, chose that name for the show over and against the perhaps more straightforward original title, The Central Park Five. Though the series did cover the story of the 5 Black and Latino boys, Yusuf Salaam, Antron McCrae, Kevin Richardson, Raymond Santana, and Corey Wise, wrongfully accused of a Central Park assault in 1989, DuVernay took issue with a title that emphasized only their supposed crimes. She argued in an interview released a few months after the show's release, quote, "It took away their faces, it took away their families, it took away their pulses and their beating hearts. It dehumanized them," unquote, claiming that the title repeated the very kinds of dehumanization to which these boys were subject in their trial. It's telling that though she explicitly states what's dehumanizing about the title, The Central Park Five, DuVernay doesn't feel the need to explain to us what's humanizing about the title When They See Us. She assumes a shared background understanding of race, racism, and racial justice that is directly invoked in the latter title. This model is one on which visibility, being seen literally or figuratively, is key to being recognized as human, with the assumption that that recognition will serve as motivation to treat people better. Here, to be made visible, recognizable, and understandable to the people and the institutions that carry out racist violence and oppression is the first step to overcoming that racism and overcoming that oppression. The underlying political narrative of this model is that the common humanity shared by dominant and oppressed groups, white and racialized groups, can and will serve as the ground for appropriate ethical treatment if and when they see us, if and when white or dominant publics finally take the time to look. As the historian, theorist, and 2019 MacArthur Genius Grant winning scholar Saidiya Hartman has pointed out, the recognition of shared humanity can be and has been the impetus not simply for bringing about anti-racist action, but also the impetus for new and at times more probing and intimate forms of racist violence and oppression. In her now famous book, Scenes of Subjection, Terror, Slavery, and Self-Making in 19th Century America, Hartman worked to trace how American anti-Black racist oppression has taken place not only through overt attempts at dehumanization, but in and in fact through the moments when white people claim to see and recognize Black humanity, both before and after emancipation. Hartman argued that though the status of enslaved people for whites made them both person and property, human and object, it is not simply their formulation as property or as object that could lead to harm. The selective recognition of the humanity of the enslaved was itself a key element in how violence against enslaved people, Black people, was justified, and one of the ways that it was incited. Hartman turns towards how enslaved people were indeed recognized as possessed of conscience, feeling, and will when it was helpful in claiming that they were human enough to be held accountable for crimes. Enslaved people were seen as human in precisely those moments when they were seen as responsible for their actions, and thus deserving of legal or extra-legal violence and sanction. These forms of intervention that took place not against, but because of the recognition of Black humanity included laws prohibiting vagrancy, work contracts stipulating personal behavior and relationships, and the intrusion of well-meaning social workers and friends of the race into the homes and daily lives of people of color, of Black people, monitoring cleanliness, familial structure, sexuality, and other elements of behavior that might serve as reasons to call in the police or other modes of correction. These tended to correct such things as resistances to unfair or undesirable working conditions, sexual relationships outside of that didn't mirror white European patriarchal dominance. Excuse me, let me repeat that. These tended to correct such things as resistances to unfair or undesirable working conditions, familial structures that didn't mirror white European patriarchal dominance, sexual relationships outside of heterosexual monogamy, And as C. Riley Snorton has pointed out in his work, Black on Both Sides, A Racial History of Trans Identity, relationships to gender that allowed for more flexibility than was made available once Black people were subject to a simultaneously humanizing and regulating gaze. As Hartman puts it, quote, under the inspecting eye and the scrutiny of the stranger's gaze, every item in the home was pretentious with meaning and arrested in a moral drama in which disorder and inefficiency decided one's fate. Sanctions awaited those outside the purview of good behavior, and in this regard, the gaze was literally arresting. Thus, much as we just discussed how conflicts over recognition can take place in and over images, Hartman analyzes a selection of slum photography taken to show the plight of Black families, where these women seem reluctant to show themselves. She chooses to read photographs that are unclear, blurry, badly framed, not as accidents or the products of models unused to the camera, but as traces of people suspicious of and resistant to its gaze. She writes that, quote, they looked out of doorways and turned their backs to the camera. They refused the terms of visibility imposed on them. They eluded the frame and remained fugitives, lovely silhouettes and dark shadows impossible to force into the grid of naturalist description or the taxonomy of slum pictures, excuse me. Hartman reads these women as refusing the lure of visibility, refusing the terms on which they might be recognized as properly human, at the same time as they're made vulnerable to the intrusion and violence that humanity itself solicits in the form of the supposed care for and uplift of the poor, whose racial history had led them to such inhuman conditions and forms of life. Hartman describes these women's refusals as engaged in what she calls, drawing on French Caribbean writer and philosopher Edouard Glissant, attempts to claim the right to opacity. Notably, Hartman draws on Glissant's term and cites him for it, while not engaging more intensely with his own theorization of opacity. And I would argue that this is in part because Glissant claims that the opacity in which he is interested is, like Hartman's, an opacity that is opposed to a transparency or recognition on others' terms. But for Glissant, quote, the opaque is not the obscure, unquote. Opacity is for him a mode of entering into new forms of relation with others. In contrast, Hartman's emphasis on practices of opacity that emphasize purposeful obscurity show how forms of recognition by white people are refused, not simply as a way of recognizing or reorganizing relationships with them, but in order to critique such relations and articulate a sense of value indifferent to or in excess of them. The philosopher and Black feminist thinker Lindsay Stewart has written on the importance of histories of this type of opacity as refusal in Black thought. She explores refusals of the terms of recognition premised on visibility to white people and white institutions, and refuses to center the importance of such recognition in people of color's lives. Stewart draws on the work of Audra Simpson, who's theorized indigenous refusals of state recognition as a way of both resisting forms of policing and rejecting attempts to cover over historical and ongoing injustices. Stewart writes that on the level of what is being refused, quote, refusal reveals the persistence of past injustices that make cooperation with and recognition by the state undesirable. Respect, whether for the self or group, mandates a refusal of the state because to accept recognition under the circumstances outlined would be an affront to one's dignity, unquote. Whereas resistance often invokes attempts to articulate one's humanity and value against dehumanization, refusal draws attention to the harms enacted in and through the kinds of recognition that claim to aim for justice while overlooking that recognition's own histories of violence and its continued policing power. At the same time, refusal points to a sense of value or respect that is not centered on the people or institutions involved in racial oppression and is not looking for their recognition. whereas the languages of resistance tend to operate in a way that turns attention back towards the group or people carrying out the work of oppression, towards what is being resisted. Stewart's turn to refusal emphasizes not struggle with or against them, but a refusal both of the terms of that recognition and of the abrogation of all meaning and values to struggles for or against it. In readings, particularly of Black practices of non-engagement with white racist institutions, practices of keeping silent, not interacting, eschewing offers of participation or self-justification, Stewart theorizes these refusals as stemming from what she calls a principled indifference, whereby Black people work to strategically ignore or minimize the centrality of white evaluations and interactions, either positive or negative, in their lives. This indifference is principled insofar as it takes place in a response to a grounding of senses of self and value and respect in Black people's own communities or in alternative practices of meaning-making grace. We can apprehend an instance of opacity and even apprehend the importance of opacity itself in attempts at forging more ethical communities, movements, and institutions, acknowledging that attempts to wholly see you and recognize you on my terms are bound to fail, while also acknowledging that I'm able to perceive something and someone of value in you nonetheless. In practical terms, something similar to this attempt to limit our focus on recognition and to apprehend people in their opacity appears in some of the contemporary discussions of racial justice that acknowledge that people of color's experiences and senses of both value and harm might not be capable of being made visible or intelligible under dominant white forms of recognition. Here we have another slide for you. This sensibility is made most evident in a slogan that has appeared on t-shirts and placards at protests proclaiming that I understand that I will never understand, however I stand. I read this statement as born out of the expanding public awareness that not all aspects of race and racism as experiences or structures are discernible in the same ways by differently racialized and located people. Acknowledging that there are things that might not be able to be shared has become a part of the wider public discourse about what race and racism are like. Instead of then claiming that the nature of racist oppression or racialized experience has to be something that can be shared, recognized, and empathized with in order to engage in racial justice, this kind of statement articulates a commitment to work for justice regardless. The premise in these statements is that we can acknowledge opacity in others, not need to recognize or understand those others on the terms through which we recognize and understand ourselves, and yet still be motivated to work with and for them in opposing forms of racial injustice. Apprehension may be enough to push for justice, without needing to call on a form of recognition that might compel us to expose what is and what might be indelibly opaque. While I think that this kind of acknowledgement of an engagement with opacity is interesting and in some senses promising both in Butler's work and in the kinds of popular understanding that give rise to this type of slogan, I worry that they underestimate the degree to which we are wedded to our attempts to see and to recognize. As Butler writes, I can apprehend that my frameworks of recognition have limits. That said, I worry that what takes place here is too placid an image of what it means to be faced with those limits, too placid an image of what it's like to deal with what we do not understand, or of what it's like to have attempts at recognition refused or rebuffed. When suddenly faced with behavior, feeling, or orientation that doesn't resemble your own, or with a rejection of an attempt to resolve that unknown into something you can communicate or empathize with, uncertainty, fear, and discomfort seem more likely emotional responses than placid acceptance. Both Butler's account of apprehension and this slogan present an image of our being faced with someone or something that we don't understand and assume that, particularly when we're interested in trying to work for justice, to feel like we're righting wrongs, or when we want to do the right thing, to really see and to act, Refusal and opacity won't cause us alarm. This statement overlooks the ways that opacity might be troubling, angering, disturbing, and resolves those feelings and concerns quickly into a sense that one already knows what to do. However I stand, right? In the slogan, what takes precedence is that I understand that I will never understand. And in the priority of my understanding, I see the challenge of opacity reined in. If I can know that I won't know, then I can preempt the threat of what is different and close myself off to what is opaque by accepting that opacity as itself having a recognizable place relative to what I do understand. I've recognized that there are things I can't recognize, which means to say I know where to put it and why it's that way. At the same time, I think that it tacitly renaturalizes opacity, makes it part of the condition of people of color and not something in which they might be actively engaged, since it is as condition that we can assume its presence and thus avoid the question of how and why we are being purposefully or intentionally refused in a given instance. Here, there's a failure to read how refusals of recognition are not simply delimitations of the role of recognition, but an indictment of its terms and of the people carrying it out. And in that slogan, I hear an attempt to co-opt the challenge of opacity, even as one claims to face it. So wrapping up, I promise. To conclude, my issue with this statement is that it too quickly resolves opacity as challenge into opacity as fact. It tries to deny the degree to which one can be and maybe should be troubled by the failures and rejections of attempts to see and recognize one's own sense of humanity in others or in people of color specifically. Forms of opacity are disorienting in that they both repudiate the presumed moral stance of those trying to see and recognize, in that they offer no easy or rote response through which we can already know what to do, and insofar as they offer an intimation but not an entrance into a world of value different from and indifferent to that of would-be onlookers or uplifters. That disorientation, anger, fear, and trouble as responses are, I think, helpful guides insofar as they call on us to not too easily assume we know who and what we're seeing, or that we know what such seeing does. It calls us to attend to what is going on in a particular circumstance and what may be asked of us in it, to what consequences and presuppositions are carried in attempts to really see people of color, and to our sense of what racial justice might mean, and to what role our attempts at recognition play in both projects of racial justice and the perpetuation of forms of racial injustice and violence simultaneously. Tonight, I've tried to outline some of how this conjunction of vision, recognition, and justice take place. And I hope I've tried to give some sense of both why and how opacity might refuse this model of justice, in both a fidelity to value that exceeds it, and in the, I hope, unsettling refusal to overlook its own forms of violence. My hope is that I've offered some sense of why it is not enough to think that justice is forthcoming when they see us, and think that they know what they see, and that there might be an ethics that calls on us to keep out of sight. Thank you.